Okay, off we go. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for tuning in on a weekday night to learn about reptiles of the Mojave Desert. This is going to be heavily focused on the snakes and the lizards of the Mojave Desert. We're going to leave out some of the other groups. We're not really going to talk about tortoises or turtles, and we don't have any crocodilians here, so we're definitely not talking about crocodilians. We're going to keep it to the squamates, being the group of reptiles that are lizards and snakes. So let's just dive in. My name is Alex Harper, and I am the Education Outreach Coordinator for Red Rock Audubon. We do a lot of things for birds, but we also do a lot of things for the habitats that birds live in. And where you have birds, you oftentimes will also have reptiles. Certainly wherever you have reptiles, you definitely have birds because birds are always around, right? But I also really enjoy reptiles. And right now is the time of year where reptiles are starting to become more active. And we're going to start to see less and less bird species as it gets warmer and warmer. So I thought, why not do something that highlights the lizards and snakes of the Mojave area, especially species that you could see around Las Vegas, being that that is where most of us are tuning in from. So here's our vision and our mission. I always put this at the beginning of every slideshow because I think it's important to kind of state who we are and how we aim to achieve certain goals. And everything that we do, or most things that we do, from what I can tell, are aligned with our vision and our mission. So I do like to have that up at the beginning. And we're going to talk about something a little different from birds, although genetically not too far off from birds or the reptiles. Birds actually diverged from reptiles quite a ways back. But reptiles are more related to birds than, say, mammals. Birds and reptiles both have scales, and both of them lay eggs. And mammals do not have scales, nor do they lay eggs. So birds and reptiles are actually fairly closely related. And once upon a time, I was about as interested, if not more interested, in reptiles than I was in birds. And I almost went down the route of working with reptiles as a herpetologist, and stuck with birds mostly because field work was much more easy to get. When you're studying birds, there's just way more opportunities to do field work, just more interest and utility in studying birds these days. So that's how it ended up for me. But I've been very incredibly fortunate to have been able to do some travel when I was younger, or in my 20s, and seen some really incredible reptiles. And that's included green anacondas in Brazil. New Year's Day, a couple years ago, I stumbled across this scene. This is a red-tailed coral snake eating a amphibian called a Sicilian. This was in Colombia. And seeing lizards like this in Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankan pit viper here, find some really large gecko species in the Amazon, and help out with the population explosion monitoring of the Burmese pythons in the Everglades. I grew up in South Florida and lived down there until some point in my 20s. And one of the things that I did in high school was actually help out some biologists remove Burmese pythons as a way to track them in the future in Everglades National Park. So they would catch them, including large females like this one here, and tag them and release them in the wild, because they would attract males, and they would be able to find where the females are attracting males and capture these males and remove them from the park as part of the effort to get rid of these invasive species. That was 15 years ago plus, and these snakes are there to stay in the Everglades in South Florida. They are now the apex predator of that ecosystem. And when I was living in South Florida many years ago, I went out to the desert, and as a reptile lover and as a bird lover, of course, I was really captivated by the desert because there's a lot going on out here. And so the many of the most impressive reptiles that I have seen have been outside of the country, but there's still a lot going on over here. And we're going to talk about some of the snakes and lizards that live in the Mojave Desert. But I think we need to drill down into what makes the Mojave Desert. And if you've seen a couple of my slideshows at this point, you know that I always have this, but I think it's always really handy to go over at the very beginning of each one. So as a reminder, a desert is defined as a biome that is receiving 10 inches of precipitation or less annually. That's an average. And of course, the consequence is that the deserts are extremely arid. Oftentimes there are losing more water than they're gaining through precipitation. So you have a high rate of evaporation in these deserts. And for us in the Mojave Desert, we are in a dry and hot desert. The Sonoran Desert is a dry and wet desert. It gets way more precipitation than we do, but still under 10 inches on average. And then we are just south of the Great Basin Desert, which will get actually quite cold and get a lot more precipitation in the winter months, especially, than we will. So we're between these two very different deserts, and we still have quite a bit of biodiversity here. So we're going to talk about the reptiles that we are getting in the Mojave Desert, but keep in mind that some of them might also go into the Sonoran Desert or even the Great Basin Desert. So not all these reptiles are unique to the Mojave, but at least part of their range or a big part of their home range falls into the Mojave Desert region. So here's sort of a cross-section of the landscape when you're looking at elevation. And let me see if I can move this little thing at the bottom just for a moment. So if you're looking at the bottom right of the screen, you're seeing a riparian woodland or creek. So think about like the Colorado River or the Virgin River, of course, the Mojave River, and even Clark County Wetlands Park. That's a riparian woodland or creek. And then you have your creosote dominant shrublands, or that's going to be your open desert. And I would say that most of your diversity is going to be within your riparian woodlands and the creosote shrublands. But you also get a lot of reptile diversity in your Joshua tree and your blackbrush communities, even your mountain mahogany and pinyon juniper woodlands, getting up to like 7,000 feet. You can still get a couple snake species and lizard species there. But once you're getting up into like the aspens and the ponderosa pines and certainly like your bristlecone pines, you're not really seeing many reptiles. Maybe you're getting the occasional western fence lizard in some of those places or a Panamint rattlesnake, but for the most part, you're not getting much up at that elevation. Most of your stuff is going to be much lower down, but anywhere you go between the Colorado River and the higher peaks of the Spring Mountains is fair game for a couple species of lizards and snakes. I'm trying to advance forward here. It's not moving, so just give it a second. Sometimes there we go. Hopefully it doesn't skip forward a couple because I pressed next a few times. So we're just looking at a cross section of different elevations and where you might expect to find different reptiles. And different reptiles are going to be favoring different vegetation zones or plant communities, because those different plant communities or vegetation zones are particular to a certain elevation, because the elevation might have a certain amount of a certain temperature range that those plants favor. So there's a relationship between plants, elevation, and temperature that is good to keep in mind whenever you're thinking about the distribution of any living animal in the desert ecosystem. So what you're looking at here is a spring day down in one of the canyons near Boulder City that goes down to the Colorado River. So this is an incredibly low elevation. And if you're looking at the plants there, you can see obviously spring, the brittle bush are starting to bloom. And I also see globe mallow blooming, creosote blooming, catclaw acacia in the wash. and I see, let's see, I'm looking for one more. I think I see a desert willow in there. So what I really suggest is going out and learning the 5 most common plants in the places that you're going. If you go to Clark County Wetlands Park, you're going to see willow trees, you're going to see catclaw acacia, honey mesquite, scroopy mesquite, and cottonwood. And you're going to start to make associations with the animals that like to live in those types of plant communities. If you go to Fletcher Canyon this summer, and I really encourage you to, if you're living in the Las Vegas area, you'll notice more ponderosa pine and pinyon pine and single leaf mahogany. And you'll recognize, okay, I'm going to expect certain species of birds or reptiles or butterflies in this type of habitat. But you don't have to memorize all the plants in the area. We have over 2,000 species in the Mojave, but many of them you're not really going to see much. What you will see are the dominant species or the indicator species for certain habitats. And so when I look at this photo, 95% of the plants that I'm seeing there fall within the same 5 species. That's always going to be very helpful to you as you get to know where to look for these reptiles and these animals. And by the way, these washes are very conducive for finding snakes like rattlesnakes, because washes function water is flowing down them, oftentimes bringing seeds with them as the water's moving downstream and depositing seeds. And so what's after those seeds? Well, lots of rodents are, mice and rats, kangaroo rats. And so because of all the rodent activity coming down for all the seeds that are ending up in these washes due to gravity or the movement of water, that's why you're getting a lot of rattlesnakes. So this is a great location to look for something like a speckled rattlesnake. I don't know why the slide is acting this way, but what you're looking at here is a road in a searchlight area. And this is the Wee Thump Wilderness. And it's sort of the end of day. And this is a great time to start looking for reptiles crossing the roads. Many snakes are active early in the morning or right at the end of day and going into the evening, especially the first few hours of the evening. So that's a great way to, or a great time to start looking for these reptiles, especially in the spring and the fall. In the summer months, many snakes might become very nocturnal. So they'll start to come out a little later in the evening. They just won't really be out at all during the day, but they might be out during the day when it's colder in the year. And they're not going to be active when it's 50 degrees at night, but they'll certainly be active when it's 80 at night. So a lot of their behavior and their movements are dictated by temperature. Now, if I wanted to see reptiles, one ways that I would do it would be by going road cruising. And that is the idea of going out on a night that is favorable for reptile movement and trying to see them as across the roads. You have to be careful though, because you can unintentionally harass the reptiles this way. And that's a hefty fine in some places. But if you're just getting out to observe them from a safe distance and not getting in the way, I think it's fair game. And you're probably not disturbing them that way. So that's a great way to look for reptiles. Tonight, on a night where we're getting actually some humidity moving through the area and a little bit of water, that's an even better time to look for snakes crossing the roads, because they typically will want to come out when it's humid. It means that there's moisture in the air, and they're trying to conserve moisture as much as possible. They're hoping that it rains. And so they might come out at those times or under those conditions. So when are reptiles most active? Well, they're mostly inactive November through March, but they'll start to come out in March, and they might be active through October, maybe into early November, but certainly by the end of November, they're very inactive. You might get some snakes or lizards moving if the temperature gets above 70 degrees Fahrenheit a couple of days in a row. You might see that. And so that's when you might see a couple of side blotch lizards. They're the most cold tolerant of the lizards, or of all the reptiles that we have. Reptiles are going to be active in the morning and the late afternoon following cold nights. So now it's probably warm enough at night that they're active all night, but certainly like 3 weeks ago when it was still very cold at night, I wouldn't expect reptiles to be out at night, as I mentioned earlier. But they're also going to avoid the hottest times of day. So as you're probably learning here, the current and the past conditions, the past conditions meaning the last few hours or days, really dictate reptile movement. It's not just what the conditions are at that moment. It also depends on what it was like, for a couple of days or weeks prior. That's very different than with birds. Might be more nocturnal in the summer, meaning they're out at night more, and they're certainly out more following a rain. That's the best time to see a desert tortoise or a Gila monster, is following a rainy event. So we're going to talk about snakes and lizards and a couple of their adaptations. We're going to focus a lot on the reptiles that you can find immediately in the Las Vegas area. Most of our snakes in the Las Vegas area have been extirpated, meaning that they're locally no longer naturally occurring. But once you get outside of the city, you can still find a couple snakes. There might be some parks or undeveloped areas that might have a couple of very small fossorial snakes that don't get any more than 10 inches long, or the occasional gopher snake. But for the most part, you don't really see snakes in the metropolitan area, but at the edges you might. And so for people at Lake Las Vegas or Lake Mead, Boulder City, and around the Henderson Bird Viewing Preserve, Clark County Wetlands, you can find this snake. This is a California king snake. Right now, the current conditions in mid-May, I would look for this snake early in the morning or late in the afternoons at those types of places, especially around water. They like to hunt rodents and reptiles, including snakes. These snakes are immune to the venom of rattlesnakes, so they will eat rattlesnakes. So one of the only predators of rattlesnakes, and so it is well deserved for them to get the king snake as one of their names. Another very adaptable species is the gopher snake. People out in the Midwest may know them as the bull snake, but the gopher snake is the name for most of the subspecies, and there are a number of subspecies. Subspecies really just meaning that related enough that they're all gopher snakes, but they might have characteristics unique to a region. And so this gopher snake actually is part of a San Diego stock of gopher snakes. And they've got these little marks at the very base of the eyes, which are really interesting. And I use this photo because they're similar enough to the ones that we have in our area, but also I just think the photo is really interesting. This is a snake that is trying to blend into this road. It's still relying on its camouflage. And I got right in front of it and took this photo. This was a couple of years ago in San Diego County. If you wanted to see this snake, you could go virtually anywhere. In the middle of the summer, they will be nocturnal. But for most of the year, they're out during the day. Like the king snake, they're probably out in the first few hours of the morning. Then it gets really hot during the day. They're not really going to be active. And then they might come back out in the late afternoon or at night. So this is a snake that you have a pretty good chance of encountering eventually as you wander the Mojave Desert. We are in an area where you can potentially get up to 6 species of rattlesnakes. All 6 species of rattlesnakes that occur in Nevada occur here in Clark County, and we have 6 species of rattlesnakes throughout the Mojave Desert, and I'm going to cover most of them. What you're looking at here is one of the most widespread rattlesnake species in the world. This is the Western Diamondback rattlesnake. You can start to see them in South Central Texas, and they go all the way into Southeastern California and well down into Mexico. So this is a snake that people often see when they're in the appropriate habitat and range for this snake. For us in Las Vegas, we're actually not within the Western Diamondback rattlesnake range. But once you get down to Laughlin and the Colorado River and even Aviquame National Monument, now you are in Western diamondback rattlesnake habitat. And much more likely for you, if you're wandering just outside of Las Vegas or Mesquite or St. George in Utah, you're going to run into this snake. This is the Mojave green rattlesnake, and green is sort of a nickname given to the snake because of its green coloration. They can be kind of gray or brown in other areas outside the Mojave. So the ones in the Mojave are sometimes called the green Mojave greens. And this snake is unique in that it has a neurotoxic and a hemotoxic venom to it. So those are two different types of venoms that function very differently. And the ones that belong to the most venomous species in the world, the elapids, that is a very large family of snakes, the elapids. That includes the king snakes, the sea snakes, kraits, the black mamba, the green mamba, and the coral snakes, all with reputations of being very venomous. If you can think of any venomous snake from Australia, surely it's a elapid. And they have a neurotoxin. So a neurotoxin is a venom that is injected from venom glands through the teeth and into the body of a living organism, and then it's going to attack their nervous system. And so death often occurs through neurological failures of some form. Maybe the heart stops pumping. So that's not a good scenario. But for most vipers, and rattlesnakes are a type of pit viper, they have a hemotoxic venom, which is going to attack the tissue in your body. And so most people actually survive rattlesnake bites because they don't tend to be fatal, although you should always go to a hospital if you're bitten by a rattlesnake. But this particular rattlesnake is unlike most rattlesnakes in that it has hemotoxins and neurotoxins in their venom, which is really interesting. Your chances of encountering them are very low, but if you spend enough time hiking outside, especially outside of the city, you're probably going to run into one of these snakes. And I've walked right by them and not have them rattle. That happens more times often than not. And I just happen to notice a snake is there after I've passed it. And on occasion, I am buzzed by them, meaning that the first detection that I have of the snake's existence is that I hear the rattle. And then, of course, you stop and you assess where the rattling is coming from and go the opposite direction. Unless, of course, you want to get a closer look, but I don't recommend that unless you feel like you know what you're really doing there and you get some experience. You know, these bites are not happening very often, and when they do, there's a certain demographic that that tends to receive snake bites more often than, say, other demographics. And so think about whether these might be male or female, and how old they might be. And I'll give you a couple seconds to think about it. And then I'm going to tell you who gets bitten by venomous snakes more than anyone else, in the United States at least. All right. Maybe you thought about it. Maybe you're just waiting for me to tell you already. It is young men in their 20s tend to get bitten far more than anyone else. And when they do, they get bitten on the hand or the forearm because they were handling the snake. And quite often, alcohol is involved. So when you're looking at snake bite statistics, do know that many of those bites are coming from people who are bitten because they were handling a wild snake, sometimes while intoxicated. So here's a young rattlesnake, and this is a young Mojave rattlesnake. I'm going to show you a video in a second of it sort of gliding across this desert scape in San Bernardino County, California, the county next to Clark County, just across the border in California. And then you're looking in the center bottom right there of a Western diamondback rattlesnake, and they look very similar, these two. And these young are born generally in the late summer or the fall with the monsoon season. So they should be young, or they should be born at a time where it's very moist and very rainy, and that's going to bring out a lot of maybe toad activity or rodent activity. And many of these snakes will be feeding on very small animals for the first few years of their lives until they're large enough to eat small rabbits and large rodents. But they are born in sync with the monsoon season. So we need our monsoon seasons across the desert Southwest to help these young make it through the first few weeks and months of their lives where mortality is at their highest. So there's your Mojave green rattlesnake called a neonate, moving around on a warm September morning. That snake was probably just a couple weeks old. So we've looked at our Western diamondback rattlesnake and our Mojave rattlesnake. Now we're looking at a third species of rattlesnake. This is the Mojave Desert sidewinder. And you get these throughout much of the West, and they're mostly around sandy washes and open desert. They really like to do what you're seeing here, and that is find a nice sandy area, and they'll move the sides of their bodies outward and then inhale and then outward again, inhale. And that kind of helps them burrow into the surface of the sand. And that snake might wait there for hours in the morning, just sort of warming up, waiting for a lizard to go by. And it won't move from there. It'll just be waiting for a lizard to go by. And as night comes, it might go hide in a burrow. And if it hasn't hunted successfully yet, it might come out that burrow the next day, find a nice spot to warm up and sit and ambush a unsuspecting lizard. So that's mostly what they're doing. That's like most of the life of a rattlesnake, is just sitting and waiting and making sure that it's regulating its temperature. This is at Death Valley. So this is still part of the Mojave Desert. This is the west side of Death Valley. And this is not a time of year where we would be likely to encounter rattlesnakes. We weren't too worried, my friend and I, climbing up this scree slope. But this is in a really good area when it's warm enough for Panamint rattlesnakes. And we're going to talk about the Panamint rattlesnakes and the southwestern speckled rattlesnakes. But these two rattlesnakes are more mountainous than the other ones. When we're looking at the Western diamondback, the Mojave, and the sidewinder, those are rattlesnakes you're likely to find in the valleys. But the ones that you're likely to find in hillsides or even mountains or anywhere with vertical terrain, this is where you're going to find these other two species. And the speckled rattlesnake, they enjoy washes, hillsides, canyons, any sort of steep terrain. You get them in the sheep range. So that's where you have Desert National Wildlife Refuge. You get them anywhere along Lake Mead and the Colorado River, all the way down to Baja. They're even throughout the Baja Peninsula. I've seen them at the Mojave National Preserve as well. But something really interesting happened between them and the Panamint rattlesnake, at least as biologists or taxonomists were concerned. So it used to be that the Panamint rattlesnake that you're looking at here and the southwestern speckled rattlesnake, it used to be considered that they were conspecific, meaning the same species. And then within the last 10 years, geneticists figured out that they're actually different snakes and should be treated as such. And so they split them into two different species. So one became the Panamint rattlesnake, the other one became the speckled. You can find speckled rattlesnakes on the east side of the Las Vegas Valley. But once you get over to Red Rock Canyon and the Spring Mountains and continue west into Death Valley or the east side of the Sierra Nevada, you have the Panamint rattlesnake. So Las Vegas is right in the center of where these two snakes diverge. So there's a story here about the divergence of these species. They probably had the same common ancestor. Then they got isolated long enough that genetically you had two different populations exist. And over time, they became the Panamint rattlesnake and the southwestern speckled rattlesnake, as we define them as human beings, right? We're always trying to name things and categorize things. So It's not a perfect system, but that's how most people who study snakes view this approach to naming species and figuring out what's what and what it should be called and what's a species and what is it and so on. Then we have our some interesting colubrids, and the lyre snake, the snake on the left. This is a snake that you can get around canyons and washes with steep terrain around them. These snakes like to crawl into cracks of washes or boulder fields and find sleeping lizards. So that's kind of their special thing. They're really good at finding sleeping lizards in the cracks of rocks. They're really thin, and they actually have a little bit of venom. If you were to get bitten by a lyre snake, you might have some swelling, but you're not going to have to go to the hospital, anything like that. But there are some colubrids, which include Liker king snakes and gopher snakes. These are colubrids that can have a little bit of a low dose of venom. And you're looking at one of them here, the lyre snake. And I think that the night snake too might also have some of that, a little bit of venom there as well. Nothing that would harm a human being, far from it. The night snakes, this is one of our most common snakes, and they're found only at night. So right now is a great time of year and probably a great evening for looking for night snakes, right as it gets dark. I saw one actually on Thursday night when I was driving up into the Springs to camp for the night. It was crossing the road shortly after dusk. I'm trying to move it to the next slide. Here we go. Here's a beautiful snake that is very common, but like many snakes, not seeing them. That is because they're mostly fossorial. Fossorial meaning that they're spending a lot of their time underground. So most animals in the Mojave Desert are spending at least part of their day underground, unless of course it's a bird. Most birds are not going underground, some will. But almost every reptile is going underground for at least part of the day. That's the only way to make it in the desert. So some of them are coming out, but really only at night to forage, but they're looking for a lot of their food underground too. One of them is the glossy snake. And that's what you're looking at here. The glossy snake has this glossy sheen to it. So you might notice that gleam. Yeah, I'm taking a photo. This is actually a photo taken at night of this snake, and you can see the gloss to it. So it's a well-named snake and very common. Another common snake is our long-nosed snake. And this is a stage photo. There's a little bit of a story behind this. About 3 years ago, I was working at an active construction site. The reason I was there was I was a biologist at the time, and I was part of a small team that was monitoring the construction going on open Mojave Desert. This was over in California to convert the desert into a solar energy facility. So they're putting up countless panels on the desert. And so they have to, they have to pave over the desert in a way to make that happen. So they're going over and scraping them with bulldozers. And I was there to look for endangered reptiles, specifically an endangered species of horned lizard out there. I didn't see any on the site, but I did see a couple common reptiles out there, including the long-nosed snake. So this is a long-nosed snake that I found one morning where they're doing construction. I removed it because somebody doing construction waved me over, and I found the snake, put it in a bucket, then took it out of the bucket, gave it some water, and it found a new area that was not going to be developed, at least anytime soon. But I did get this photo next to this pelvis that I found out there. So this is kind of a cool photo, but that's a long-nosed snake, another fossorial snake, like many of the snakes here in the Mojave Desert. If you go up into slightly higher elevations, so Flagstaff area, if you go into the Beaver area or Eagle Point area of Utah this spring, or maybe you go into the Sierra Nevada, You might find the garter snakes up there. Terrestrial garter snakes are the ones that we get in the West, but you're not really seeing them in open desert. They like to be in areas that have consistent amphibians, and for whatever reason, they're not in open Mojave river systems where we have introduced bullfrogs and we have, one or two toad species in most places, but not consistent enough for garter snakes, I guess. So go into a place that has more amphibian diversity in the region and you might run into garter snakes. Here's a snake that I have not seen in the Mojave, although they are here. This is a ringneck snake, a regal ringneck snake, and this is the underside of the snake that you're seeing. So one of their adaptations is one where they're attempting to scare off a possible predator. And in this case, I'm the possible predator that it's trying to intimidate, and it's trying to intimidate me through flashing these colors that typically in nature mean poisonous, meaning if I ate it, I would have a reaction to it. That's not the same as venomous. Venomous would be, a specific protein-based substance that's coming out of the gland, and then I'm biting in, and once it's in the blood system, it causes issues. I'm talking about poison as something that you're ingesting and you have issues as a result of ingesting the poison. So that's what this snake is trying to do. It's trying to convince me that it is something that I do not want to eat, that I'm going to have all sorts of issues if I do, and the best thing to do is to leave it alone. I took this photo in Southeast Arizona a couple of years ago, but they are here. Apparently they're in the Spring Mountains and they're definitely close by in the St. George area. So I think mid-elevation is where you can get them. It's a snake that I would love to see close to Las Vegas. While on the topic of really brightly colored snakes that you don't want to mess with, this is a Sonoran coral snake. We do not have any coral snakes in the Mojave Desert, and certainly not in the Las Vegas area. The Sonoran coral snake is in the Sonoran Desert, and I don't think you really start to get close to any coral snakes until you're maybe around Phoenix or Tucson in Arizona, and you're not really likely to see them. But what you're seeing here is a Sonoran coral snake, and look at the color scheme of these bands. You notice all these bands running down the length of the body from the head, which is black and rounded, and running down towards the tail. The tail's just on the upper part of that large rock, just right at the center of the photo. That's the tail there. And the sequence there is red to yellow, and black is touching yellow there. So what you're looking at for the, to make use of one of the, one of the phrases that people use to remember what's venomous and what's not, and that's red to yellow, kill a fellow, red to black, venom lack. So if this had red touching black, it would be friend of Jack or venom lack. And that's useful in North America and the United States, but once you get into the tropics of Central America and South America, that's no longer helpful. They have just too many species of coral snakes, and not all of them have that combination. So I want to dispel that myth for you, just in case you ever head down to Central or South America and see a colorful snake. So there are many other snakes that we could have taken a look at, but I wanted to talk about some that you might run into eventually or that are especially interesting. But now we're moving over to the other squamates. These are our lizards. So I'm starting off with this lizard because it's the most likely lizard that you will see on any given day around the Mojave Desert, and especially around Las Vegas. In most places, you still can see side blotch lizards. They've adjusted pretty well to the modification of creosote desert like we have had in the Las Vegas Valley. As long as you find a park or a undisturbed area that has some native habitat, you'll probably see the side blotch lizard. They're also one of the most cold tolerant of any of the Mojave reptiles. So when it starts to warm up in the late winter, this might be one of the first reptiles that emerges from hiding. They'll come out as soon as it gets north of like 50 or 55 degrees Fahrenheit. You can see them out. They're not far from wherever they're hiding. They're just coming out to get a little bit of the sun at the entrance of the burrow or their little rock complex that they live in. and then they're going to head back in. But they're quite small. Usually they have a little bit of blue or a little bit of orange on them. And they're really sweet little lizards. They're almost always on the ground, and they have a very small home range. You can look for them at most parks in Las Vegas that have at least some understory. Some of the parks that only have tall trees, you're not really going to find much of anything. But if you went to Clark County Wetlands, the Henderson Bird Viewing Preserve, I think Cornerstone Park would have them. I've seen them at Pittman Wash. They're around most places. So that's the side-blotched lizard. Another lizard that you are likely to run into is the Great Basin whiptail. I see Great Basin whiptails at most areas at the edge of Las Vegas. So Floyd Lamb, because Floyd Lamb Park is right at the edge of Las Vegas. I've seen them at Pueblo Park in Summerlin, Clark County Wetlands Park, of course, and the Las Vegas Wash, Henderson Bird Viewing Preserve, and Lake Mead, Aviquame, Red Rock Canyon. You're going to get these lizards pretty frequently. They're coming out right when temperatures hit around 75 or 80 degrees, and they're going to be active throughout the day. Activity might drop off a little bit in the middle of the day when it's just really hot, but they'll be out moving. They'll be one of the first reptiles moving. And they have this really unique stop, go motion to them. So they're always on the ground. You never see them in trees. They have incredibly long tails and pointed snouts. And you'll see them sort of scooching forward really fast and then stopping for maybe a second. And when they stop, they put their tongue onto the ground because that's their way of tasting what has been moving through that area. So they might be following scents of things and just trying to figure out what's around. And so when they stop, they're using that tongue to basically taste who's around. And then they'll scooch forward again. It's really unique. Not a lot of lizards exhibit that behavior in our area, although it's a classic behavior for whiptail. So kind of like when we're looking at bird movement or bird behavior and we're trying to identify birds, do that with snakes and lizards too. A lot of our lizards especially have a lot of character and a lot of uniqueness to the ways that they move around. So watch those lizards closely, especially the whiptails, and you'll start to notice some themes. This beefy guy, this is a yellow-backed spiny lizard. This is a species of lizard that actually gets pretty chonky. They get pretty big. They have that really thick neck, a small head, very thick torso. And then the tail here would look a little bit more like similarly colored and patterned as the rest of the body, but this tail actually got removed. Maybe the lizard purposefully dropped its tail. Most lizards have the ability to do that, especially lizards in our area. And that's to drop the tail when something has captured them or they're fearful. And this is a brilliant mechanism to escape predation because, of course, if there's a bobcat chasing them or a fox chasing them, the most likely thing they're going to grab on the lizard is the tail. So if they just drop the tail, the rest of the animal can take away and they'll regenerate a tail. So this tail is regenerating and it's not quite where it will be. It'll look like almost exactly the same as the original, but it's in that process. That's a really interesting adaptation that lizards have. I see the yellow-backed spiny lizard at a lot of parks in and around Las Vegas. They love Joshua tree forests. They like any semi-forested area or forested area. So I get them in the cottonwood galleries of the Colorado River and the Clark County Wetlands Park. I just find like mesquite trees and cottonwoods, and they're going to be around there on a warm day. I've seen them in my neighborhood, and I live in an area with lots of cats, very close to UNLV and Maryland and Tropicana. It's not a place that I expect to see lots of lizards, but this is one of the only ones that I get. So it can be a neighborhood lizard, the yellow-backed spiny lizard. This is always a crowd favorite. This is the desert horned lizard. There are a couple species of horned lizards in the American West and down in Mexico. And the one that we have in the low elevations is the desert horn lizard. I typically will see them mid-morning and late afternoon in the spring, and early morning and late afternoon when it's the middle of the summer and it's just really hot. I see them in very open habitat, and they don't like lots of trees around. They're just around a couple shrubs, and they don't move that much. They're going to rely on their camouflage to stay absolutely still. And then if they're discovered by a predator, they're hoping that their spiny armor that lines their body and on top of their head is going to ward off predators. So hopefully it doesn't look that appealing to a snake, for example. It looks like kind of a formidable creature, but it's not very fast, and it relies again on that camouflage. And you can find them in areas where you get lots of ant activity. So once you start seeing ants in open desert, start looking around, because you might have these little guys. And typically you don't see them until you see them kind of scurry off. They might scurry just a few feet. So look for something, and maybe if it catches your eye, you have found yourself a horned lizard. Outside of Corn Creek Field Station, so not in Corn Creek itself, but perhaps that entrance road, I might expect to see a desert horned lizard out there, the Mojave National Preserve. Any roads that are not well traveled but have the asphalt or they're paved, that's going to be easier to find them, because they like to come out, especially after a cool night. They want to come out and thermoregulate. We do have a native species of gecko here. It's the desert banded gecko. We also have a non-native species of gecko. It's called the Mediterranean gecko. If you're seeing a gecko in Las Vegas or in Henderson or right in downtown Boulder City, you're probably looking at the non-native, the Mediterranean gecko. The Mediterranean gecko can actually move up glass. The way that geckos are able to do this is actually not through any sort of suction cup sort of feature to their feet, but actually they have lots of little follicles that are extremely tiny. But when they put their hands up to a surface like glass, there are so many little cracks in the glass that the follicles will fit into them, and somehow that animal is able to climb up a vertical surface. So we look at it and think that it's defying gravity, but there's something happening at a very microscopic level that we can't really perceive. That's how they're able to do it. The native gecko doesn't do that. And I see these geckos quite frequently when I'm driving rural areas at night during the summer. I saw one the other night when I was driving up Kyle Canyon. I was just paying attention and noticed them. And I need to plug in my laptop. So give me like 10 seconds and just admire this gecko that really did not want to be uncovered from where it was hiding one morning over in California a couple springs ago. Okay, so that's here. Banded gecko. I see a lot at Lake Mead sometimes at night when I'm driving through there. It's a super cool lizard. You might be noticing that long tail, that relatively small head, and the intricate sort of wine-colored patterning on the tail. I'm seeing bands on the tail, so they run kind of vertical, and then on the body, they're running the opposite direction. They're running along the length of the animal. So I'm really paying attention to a lot of the patterns that I see on lizards, as well as the habitat and a couple of their behaviors to try to tell them apart. And this desert iguana is interesting in that it's actually related to the iguanas. There are a couple species of iguanas that live in Central and South America in the tropics, but we also have some iguanas in the Southwest. They're not the same as the ones that we're thinking of. We're usually thinking of a green iguana or a marine iguana from the Galapagos. But the desert iguana, like the other iguanas, eats primarily plant material. And their favorite plant is the creosote. They love creosote leaves. And fortunately for them, The creosote is a dominant species of plant in certain elevations of the Mojave Desert. So I might look for the desert iguana at Lake Mead, at Ash Meadows, at Corn Creek, not in the orchard area, but outside of it. I might look for that animal. I think I mentioned Ash Meadows. I've seen them at Ash Meadows and the Mojave National Preserve. They're also one of the most heat tolerant of all reptiles. You might find them hanging out on the pavement of a road in the middle of the summer. This was probably the lizard that I saw at Ash Meadows one May one year. This is pretty dark asphalt, and it might have been like 95 degrees on that day. So very, very high tolerance. Part of that is because they're white and they release a lot of that heat very quickly. If they were black, they would absorb a lot of it and they'd probably be less heat tolerant because they would overheat much more easily than a white animal. If you move up into the Spring Mountains or go up into the mountains of the Sierra or up to Flagstaff this summer, look for this lizard. It's actually really abundant once you get up to like 5,000 or 6,000 feet in elevation, or you're in the Ponderosa Pine Forest. This is a Western fence lizard. Look at those really spiny scales there, kind of like our spiny lizard. They are related. And like the spiny lizard, they might have blue underneath them. And so the males of many lizards actually can be very brightly patterned. The females might have some bright patterns too, but typically the males are the ones that are a little bit more showy. And like in birds, this is mostly to show off the level of fitness of their genes. A very attractive animal might be the one that is most brightly patterned, and that's going to attract a very choosy mate who theoretically might also have very strong genes. And so together, these two attractive animals might have offspring that are genetically more superior than, or more lucky than neighboring lizards born from different adults. And so this is part of the sexual selection process that a lot of reptiles engage in. Very, very similar to how it operates in birds. Lizards and birds have a lot of similarities. So get out there and enjoy the way that some of these lizards conduct themselves. Lizards are far more complex than snakes, I think, although both of them will surprise you. We have a couple lizards in the Mojave that eat other lizards, and here's one of them. This is the Great Basin collared lizard. The other one that is famous for eating lizards is the leopard lizard. I didn't include one. I should have, because it's a really neat lizard. It's very beautiful. But so is the Great Basin collared lizard. And what they'll do is they'll sit up on a prominent rock. They tend to be very large, and so they are not afraid of that many predators. They're very fast. Lizards have ears, unlike snakes. Snakes don't have ears, so they're not relying on hearing. Lizards have exceptional hearing, and they also have exceptional eyesight. They also recognize eye contact. So if you make eye contact with a lizard, it may recognize that it has been seen. So if you want to get a good look at a lizard, try not to make direct eye contact with that lizard. They recognize that. Snakes don't really seem to react the same way as lizards when eye contact has been made. Same with birds. You make eye contact with a bird, and it may recognize that as being seen. So very interesting that they're able to do that. Sometimes we don't give these animals as much credit for their intelligence or adaptations as they might have. So this Great Basin collared lizard, you can see, has a lot of orange to it. Around the neck, you have that black and white collar. Kind of reminds me of a killdeer's collar, if you're familiar with that bird. So I suspect many of you are. And then on the back, you have very small scales. Very unlike that fence lizard, very unlike that spiny lizard. Those scales are extremely small and granular, almost like little bits of sand. And you can compare that collared lizard with this here fence lizard on the left, and notice that the shapes of those scales are very different. And on that fence lizard, you have those spiny scales versus the granular scales of lizards. And so looking at the scales of these animals can often be really helpful in helping you tell what you're looking at. The physiology will help you get a better sense of what you're looking at too. So the leopard lizard, the one on the right, they have these really long, gangly arms. Their hind legs are pretty long too. You can't really appreciate that from that photo. Again, we're talking about the lizard on the right. They're very long, so they can run out and run at very high speeds for relatively long distance and grab another lizard. The fence lizard, it just wants to hop off of a fence or a log and catch an ant or a beetle, something moving much more slowly. So different adaptations or physiological adaptations exhibit themselves in lizards. And once you know a little bit about what they eat, you can actually take some pretty educated guesses as to what their physiology is going to be, their physiology being the way that they are shaped. That's all I have as far as slides go, but I did want to share a couple resources and then we can open up to any questions. Somehow looks like I've gone to an hour. So I guess, yeah, I get lost in time sometimes with these, but I want to show you a couple books that I have in my hand. So maybe we will exit the screen sharing so that I can hold them up and show them to you. But for now, if you look at your screen, you see there californiaherps.com. That's a great online resource. Because we share the Mojave Desert with Southeastern California, we have a lot of overlap between the reptiles that are found in California and the ones that are found here. And virtually anything that you'd ever want to know about any reptile occurring in Las Vegas surely occurs in San Bernardino County. Therefore, California Herps is going to have something on it. So that said, I will stop sharing and I will hold up one of these books here for you as a reference. So this is the, let's try that. This is Arizona's Amphibians and Reptiles. I'm going to have to take the blur off. Blur my background, no more of that. Okay, that's what it looks like. And you might be thinking, well, most of us are living in Las Vegas. Does this apply to us? Kind of, because in the northwestern part of Arizona is the Mojave Desert. And anything that can be found in the Mojave Desert in Arizona is going to be found in Boulder City or in some part on the west side of the Colorado River. So they cover them really well. I really love the species accounts in here. You can learn a lot about the species that you're interested in from this book. Then there's one that is a local book that you can find at most visitor centers, I think, and it is Reptiles and Amphibians of the Mojave Desert. It's a smaller book. It has accounts for every species of reptile or amphibian that occurs naturally in the Mojave Desert, but it has very little information on them. So it has information on the general habitats, what they eat, a little bit about them, but if you're really hoping to learn a lot about the reptile, it's not going to have as much as, say, Arizona's Amphibians and Reptiles. So I actually like to use both at the same time. This one's going to be a good field reference if I need to make a quick ID, but if I want to learn more about it, I'm going to go to that Arizona book. And then there is the field craft side. So there is a book that is the field herping guide. And so this is going to help you learn how to get out there and find reptiles and amphibians and figure out what their movements are and some of the practices. Actually know one of the guys that helped to get this book out there in the world. His name is Josh Holbrook, and I know him from South Florida. He's catching a lot of pythons down there and doing some really cool research on them when I was living in South Florida. So I really think it's a great guide, and it's not specific to the Mojave, but it's good anywhere in the world that you get reptiles and amphibians. So that's what I got for you tonight. I think reptiles are spectacular, and if you get out there certain times of the day, you have a good chance of seeing many lizard species and maybe even a couple snakes out there outside of Las Vegas. So if you have questions, raise your hand. Maybe I'll try to go through and take questions that way, or put them in the chat, and then I'll read them out, and then try to answer them as best I can. All right, I'm not seeing any questions and coming up. Oh, Lauren, you had something? All right, Lauren. Oh, is it the one in the chat? Do I have a favorite Mojave reptile? Favorite Mojave reptile. I like sidewinders. Yeah, I've seen a couple sidewinders, especially working as a field biologist in certain habitats. Like you run into them every now and then in the spring, and the sidewinder is just such a unique little rattlesnake that I think that might be like my personal favorite. But it's probably maybe one of the snakes I haven't seen yet, like the leaf-nosed or shovel-nosed snake. Those are pretty cool too. Thank you, Olivia. I appreciate that. Always get a lot of love from you. George asked a good question. Have I seen the Gila monster in the Vegas area? Is it a subspecies? Okay, so the Gila monster is one of those just amazing lizards that you get in some parts of the desert Southwest. You get them in the Sonoran Desert and in the Mojave Desert. There is a Sonoran subspecies and there is a Mojave subspecies. I've seen the Sonoran subspecies down in Arizona. Once was south of Tucson in May, and another one was a different May. This was closer to the New Mexico border. Similar habitat. It was like mesquite, mostly like the mesquite scrub that they were in. And I've seen that subspecies, but the ones that are here, I think it's the banded Gila monster. I have not seen. The best ways to see them apparently are just walking washes in the McCullough Range, in the Blue Diamond area, and Valley of Fire that I've heard. But you get them down in like Aviqua, New Hampshire, around the Colorado, but they spend like 99% of their lives underground, and they come out just for a couple hours and do their thing. And they're obviously pretty efficient at doing that. But I think if you go out after spring rain, you have probably as good chance as anything. But I've never seen one here, and they're definitely different subspecies as the ones down in Arizona. CJ, you got a question. Rattlesnakes not rattling when you're quite close. I thought they always rattled. Experienced it last summer in Arizona. We trekked by the snake with near ear rattle. Okay, well, this does happen. I've walked by a lot of rattlesnakes that didn't rattle, and I think that it is incorrect that that there should be the assumption that they will always rattle. They won't always rattle. Sometimes
I know that now. I know that now.
And a lot of the time, like they're not even aware of the fact that you were there. Sometimes they're just sleeping, or they are relying on their camouflage and not rattling. Because as soon as they rattle, they're basically saying like, okay, I recognize I'm being seen. If they don't think that they've been seen, sometimes they will just sit tight. And so typically like a snake that is still and in a coil, it's probably thermoregulating, or it's waiting in ambush. And it's probably not going to rattle if you go by, unless you like walked in front of it and stopped. And maybe if you like stood there for a couple seconds, it would be like, okay, obviously like this thing has seen me. I'm ready to fight, or I'm getting ready to fight. But I would say, yeah. And some of the big rattlesnakes may be less likely to buzz you. Some of the smaller species, they can be really testy, and that they'll be quick to let you know that you're close. Like some of the small species in Arizona, but none that you have here. There's no rhyme or reason. There's to my eye.
Well, I learned a very valuable lesson. So
Was that in with Red Rock?
We'd gone down to Sierra Vista,
Mm,
with Doug Chang and several others,
yeah.
Barbara and I, and 8 or 10 of us went by this snake, and the last person in the queue went,
Yeah.
there's a snake there.
That I've seen that happen so many
Yeah.
times with rattlesnakes and cottonmouths, because I'm from Florida. We actually run into cottonmouths more than rattlesnakes. You know, we ran into a lot of cottonmouths that would just sit motionless, and they're just hoping that you go by them without them having to move.
Got it.
It's one of those things that like might make you feel less confident around snakes because you realize just how often you're going by them without them letting you know. But I kind of take it as, well, they're not out to get you if you're walking by them and they're not biting you. You know, it's like depends on how you look at it, I think.
Yeah. Thanks.
George asked a couple questions. I don't think they can regenerate their rattle if it's lost. I don't think that they can, but I would double check on that. I think if it's completely lost, then it's gone forever. So they're unlike what lizards can do. What do I see snakes and birds in terms of population? George, do you mean like in population trends overall in the Mojave? Well, yeah, birds are definitely more well known because birds are easier to study. So a lot of your population studies that are done to gain insight into the overall health of the environment, like birds are going to be the best thing. It's better than insects. It's better than plants. It's better than reptiles. It's certainly better than insects or arthropods. You just use birds, right? And so there's a lot of data on birds that give insight into the overall health of the Mojave environment. What we're seeing is a really big reduction in overall populations of many species across the Mojave Desert because of aridification mostly and climate change associated things. You know, and the cumulative effects of just a lot of things harming bird populations for the last several hundred years. So that's a lot easier to do. With reptiles, there's just way less data being collected out there. There's just not as much love for reptiles. This is not backed up by any science. My impression is that the reptile population is sort of in line with what's happening with a lot of birds. In that with their aridification of the Mojave Desert, their populations go down, partially because they're not, like, even though reptiles can hang on quite a bit through drought, like they have the ability to store water and hold on to water a lot longer than other animals. One of the problems is that rodents are not. And so the things that they eat may not be able to tolerate the heat as well as the reptiles, and they might die first. But if the plants start to pump out a bunch of seeds, then the rodents might make a huge comeback, and then the reptiles can sort of come back. That follows a really big rainy year like we just had. So I think that, you know, this year will be a better year for everything in the Mojave, but you just don't know what's going to happen, you know, years down the line. But I think that there's probably a strong connection between what birds are doing and what reptiles are doing. I'll take one more question and then probably head on out. These are good questions. Yeah, thank you, George. Lauren asks, can burrow shapes indicate snakes versus lizard? Oh, that's a good question. Not, I mean, maybe some of the lizards, but I have never heard of that. I have never heard of anyone using burrow shapes for that. Typically, snakes are using burrows that other animals have made. And so they're living in the burrows that fit the forms of other things that are better burrowers, like rodents or desert tortoise are really important out there too for some of the larger snakes for providing big burrows. With lizards, there might be a little bit of it, but not that I've heard of. Sometimes they go into like a rock pile, and so the entrance doesn't take the shape of the lizard. But that's a really interesting question. It's not something I would have ever asked, but it's a good one. Cool. Well, CJ, thanks for the compliment. thanks for dropping a compliment in there if you have. And thanks for showing up. I really appreciate that. Thank you, Constance. Thank you, Jennifer and George. Get out there and look for things. You know, at the Henderson Bird Viewing Preserve, this time of year, as soon as you walk out into the hummingbird area, start looking for ornate tree lizards. And then you can find whiptails, you can find zebra tail lizards, you can find spiny lizards, surely banded geckos out there at night. I mean, you can find 5 or 6 species of lizards at many of our parks in the vicinity of Las Vegas. So get out there and try to figure out what they are. Pay attention to the type of terrain that they like to be on, if they're in a tree or if they're in a rock pile or on the ground, how they're moving. Look at the overall pattern, look at the overall shape of the lizard, just like in birds. Looking at the overall shape of the bird is going to be helpful. Same thing with reptiles. And they don't make sounds. Some geckos in the world do make sounds. And of course, some snakes can hiss, but you're not going to tell them apart like you will with birds. So really pay attention to the habitat that you're in and those other things, and you'll start to figure them out. And they'll be active most of the summer. So except for those really hot points of the hot days. So get out there and enjoy them when the birds are off somewhere far, far away. I'm gonna shut it down. There is a NBA basketball game I'm gonna go check out. The Miami Heat are playing the Celtics, so I'm gonna go pop into that and see what's going on. Thank you all so much for joining me, and we'll do this again at some point in the summer. See ya.